Yep. Hey, Brian, how are you?
Good. Doing very well. Well, we're after 8 o'clock here, so people might be jumping in and jumping out. But for everybody on the call right now,
Yeah.
thanks for giving this a go. I've seen a lot of virtual wine tastings that have been organized over the last couple of months as this has been going on. And I've kind of held off from doing anything, mainly because it's difficult to get wines in everybody's hands. I wasn't sure who might still have some of the Desire wines, or any of our other wines for that matter, undrunk yet. But thought this might be a cool, different spin on it to gather everybody together to actually meet and talk to a winemaker, because we are a long-distance wine club based in Florida, but we're dealing with all our friends on the West Coast. You know, we try to really bring you close to them through their wines and through their story and the guidebook and the emails. But I thought this would be a fun way so that Cody's not just on here talking about, what his wine tastes like the whole time when people may or may not have that bottle of wine open. We're actually getting to know him a little bit, talk about some of the vineyards like we already started doing, where some of this comes from, and generally just talk about what's going on the West Coast right now, how this is affecting the economics of wine, how that might affect us, and we can get wine, what wines we can drink. So without further ado, I want to introduce Cody Rasmussen,
Thanks, Brian.
Desire Wines Co. He's been great enough to join us tonight. And if you would, I know everyone got your bio from when we did your release back in February, but you want to just take a couple of minutes and tell us about yourself?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for organizing, by the way. This is fun. It's nice to see folks. So my wife and I, Emily, grew up in Iowa, Northwest Iowa, a small little town. It's like 5,000 people, and both of our families are actually still back there. I think my mom and her parents lived like 4 blocks apart, and the high school is in between the two. And we started dating in high school. I went to college on the East Coast in Western Massachusetts. Em stayed home, and then got married after that and moved out here for wine. And being from a small town in Iowa, there's not, well, as a kid, I would have said there's nobody in town that drinks wine or alcohol. Come to find out, there's a whole lot more people that drink wine than they let on. We've actually got quite a few followers back there, a lot of Em's parents' friends. But I didn't grow up with it. So my first wine, we had at a Lutheran church for communion. And then beyond that, I literally didn't touch the stuff until sophomore year in college, it would have been. I was on a study abroad for what we called J-term in South Africa. And one of the days they took us to Stellenbosch, and we tasted a couple wine places. And I remember, it's funny, it was in my very first cover letter when I applied for a wine job, that we walked into the tasting room and they had along the wall vials of soil and soil profiles. They did a cutaway of, say, the top 5 feet of the soil horizon. And you had big rocks in the bottom, and then the clay and loam and sand and stuff like that up here. And each one looked different. And it's absolutely stuck in my brain that somehow that made a difference for the wine. And I thought that was the craziest, most fascinating idea. So I tried the wine there and didn't particularly love it, to be honest. Just as a general category, I was like, I thought wine would be amazing, and it seems fine. But that kind of opened my eyes. And then I spent junior year, fall semester in Rome for 4 months. And I was on scholarship at Williams at the time, and part of that was because the program in Rome didn't provide lunch or dinner. The college literally just gave me cash to eat out in Rome for 4 months straight, which was fantastic. And there were a lot of restaurants where you're paying for water anyway, so most nights we'd be like, we'll try the house red or white, and just seeing, you roll in at 7:30, say, and the place is empty. There's nobody there, and all of a sudden, 8:39, people start coming in with their kids, grandma, grandpa, whatever it is, and seeing people sitting down over dinner together with wine, kind of as a centerpiece, was really cool. And I think that's definitely piqued the interest for me. So I got back to college, I had a background in economics and political science, so I was looking at either iBanking or management consulting, and it really had a couple interviews and was having a hard time explaining why I wanted to do it. And come to find out for myself, it's actually just because I didn't want to do it. And the interviewers seemed to pick up on that more quickly than I did. But anyways, cutting forward, I guess my wife and I moved out to California. I got a gig at Boleto Vineyards in the Russian River Valley for 4 months as a harvest intern. And that's just kind of the way you start. I mean, most wineries are looking for extra help through harvest because most places aren't picking. But just in terms of managing fermentations, moving barrels around, punch down pump overs, there's a lot of labor involved in harvest. Usually 2 to 5 times more than any place can staff with their full-timers. So there's just kind of, you see folks rotate through the industry, you work a lot of different places, you make a lot of friends, you see a lot of different wines, and kind of a crew experience that way. And that did it for me. I was totally hooked. My wife actually started working in the industry too on the other side of it, though. She does marketing, mostly communications, a little bit of sales, a little bit of PR, and kind of runs that side of Desire Lines for us and for a couple other clients here locally. But it's a great industry. I mean, we love wine, and Northern California, oddly enough, feels a little like home. We have family come out expecting it to look like Hollywood. And you drive through West County and there's, broad open pastures, cows, the vineyards are beautiful. I like to hike and bike and run. So we kind of got stuck here. It's a nice place.
Yeah, it is. I think that's one surprising thing for folks that go out there for the first time. Especially a lot of people say Napa as their target, right?
Yeah, right.
You get a little bit more of the glitz, but especially when you get out to like West Sonoma County, like you said, with all the pastures.
It's beautiful. Gorgeous.
I mean, a lot of broken down barns out there, and I mean, it could be a lot of places in Middle America.
Yeah, exactly, and that's kind of where we find a lot of our vineyards. Because you're right, I think a lot of people picture wine country as the glitz and glam of Napa. But in reality, a lot of the folks we work with are 3rd, 4th generation farmers. They're not making much margin. They've only left the grapevines in the ground for 100 years because they love them, and it's a passion thing all around.
Yeah. So I've got a side question. If anybody has a question along the way, feel free to jump in. It's kind of a group discussion. I'll kind of guide it and keep peppering questions at Cody. But if anybody else says anything along the way, feel free to jump in. But wanted to ask just about then when you guys started Desire Lines and
Mm-hmm.
what your kind of different take and spin, your goal in founding that was.
Totally. It's honestly been kind of a process of discovery, which is part of the reason we named it Desire Lines. The term being, it's a hard to describe. If you were walking along 2 sidewalks and see a little dirt path that cuts between them, that's a Desire Line. So you see it a lot in urban planning and a little bit in tech in terms of hashtags. Actually, in Twitter are Desire Lines. In that they didn't code it in initially, and you can go back and all of a sudden you see folks being like, hey, we should use hashtags to explain what it is we do. So the whole concept being it's something you discover over time. It's your own personal path. Something that wasn't designed initially, in other words. And I like to run, like I said, and trail run, and there's a lot of them out there. So we got started in 2014. We were kind of just thrust into it. We're going to tell the story next week on a special release, but the first wine we ever made, we never sold. Yeah. And the grapes were a gift from Morgan and Chris, my 2 bosses at Bedrock and 2 of my dearest friends. And the idea was, here's a ton of grapes. Do whatever you want with it. And if you want to sell it, it's yours. Whatever it is, go for it. And it was super kind. And in retrospect, really savvy too. Because an intern, it's super common. It's really easy to walk in and you got lots of ideas about how wine should be made, but you have none of the responsibility. And it's really easy as an intern to say, I think the winemaker's being really boring. They're not pushing the envelope. We should be using no sulfur all the way, whatever it is. And then you do it yourself, like I did in 2014, and all of a sudden it's on you and it's your baby and you really care about it. And it's a whole different ballgame. And that's really important to us. Like now that we've built up a couple vintages for a couple different farmers, all of a sudden there's a lot of responsibility to make sure that, the person that took care of the grapes for all those years, we're doing justice to. Same for the vertical. We don't want to lose a wine. And we still tend to be on the more natural end of the spectrum, but I think that's really smart to start to have to make your own wines. But then after that, so 2015, we still weren't planning on launching a wine brand. It's expensive. We were young. We were 24, 25 at the time. And I found out that my favorite vineyard in California, Griffin's Lair, had a row of Syrah available through Morgan. And we kind of said, we'll take it. I don't know how we're going to do it. I don't know what we'll do. I don't know how I'll pay for it, but we'll definitely take it. And that started it. And at that point, we knew we kind of needed to launch a couple more SKUs. Went out and found Riesling at Cole Ranch because I adore Riesling. That's why I work in wine in the first place, because I love German Riesling. And then Hardy from Dirty and Rowdy introduced us to Ann at Shake Ridge. We picked that up. And a couple others, but it's kind of, we've tended to nibble around the periphery of California per se, that is. We don't have a lot of vineyards close to where we live here in Sonoma or Napa. in part because the fruit around here is quite expensive, in part because I actually just like to drive around. So we've got, Cole Ranch is 2.5 hours north, Shake Ridge 2.5 hours east. It's a big vineyard loop. If we drove them all in one day, it'd be probably 8 or 10 hours of driving. And I love the expressions of different places. I mean, I love the Sierra foothills, getting up there, and so we'll go up and see Shake. Cole Ranch is tucked way up in the mountains between Boonville and Ukiah, so kind of north of Healdsburg, Bryan. Little highway called 253. I bet you've never been on it. It's in the middle of nowhere. When we went up, we were worried in harvest that we were going to run into some pot growers, because it's kind of in that area, like if it's fall, you're careful about what you go and you let people know where you're going. It wasn't as scary as we thought, but our vineyards are all over, and that's kind of part of the fun, seeing why they taste the way they do, and it's always because of where they come from.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you're kind of casting a net and being able to represent several different parts of California to people through wines. You're not, and that's kind of the interesting thing about having a brand that's not all like a state based, right? Which is cool because somebody owns that land and they're making wine just from that land, and so you know exactly where it comes from, and you go visit them, you're on that land. But what you guys do targeting, and I gotta say, I think certainly your connection and friendship with Morgan's got to help a lot. But I mean, you guys got linked right into some of the coolest vineyards in California, and so to kind of be able to do some single vineyard versions of that and represent those different vineyards across California is a pretty cool aspect of the project.
We've been really fortunate to find some of the best vineyards there are, and it's always been friends and family who've introduced us. It's a very small industry in that sense. But yeah, I think that's just fascinating. We make all the wines mostly the same, and they all taste different just because where they're from, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. So yeah, we do cast our net pretty far afield to find vineyard sites.
Yeah. Now, and you're still at Bedrock. You're the assistant winemaker there.
Yep, that's right.
And you make your personal wines. Yeah, you make your personal wines there at that winery, right?
Yeah, Morgan gives us free custom crush there. We're only doing 8 or 10 tons, but super kind of him. Gives me a dark corner basically, tuck my wines into.
Yeah. So comparatively, for a new and up and coming brand, how much wine do you make compared to say Bedrock, and say compared to a larger brand that people might be familiar with? Like how small is this small scale size?
Tiny, absolutely tiny. What's the best analogy? If I top all my barrels, which we do, every winery tops all their barrels every, say, 4 to 8 weeks. It's that angel share people talk about. Wine evaporates and you need to replace that, otherwise everything in there turns to vinegar. I can top all mine in like 2 hours flat, and that's all the time I need, and that's once a month. So whereas you imagine most wineries have a couple people on staff. We have 3 people in the cellar with me, 2 others at Bedrock that take care of that and lots of other stuff. But I mean, we're a tiny little passion project. But on a SKU basis, we're up to 8 or 9 different wines now, which is hell on a vineyard loop to have to drive to them all, but so I'm making life hard on myself.
Yeah.
But so we make a lot of very small production wines just because we think it's interesting. But we did, I think, 200 cases last year.
200 cases? Okay. And how much is
Cody, Brian, could I interject? Can I ask a question? How has it affected you with the quarantine, restaurant business being closed? How does that affect someone small like you?
It's had a huge impact, not so much in the day-to-day, in that all of the business operations of a winery or anything in the winery that's protecting the capital assets is an essential business. So topping the barrels like we were just talking about, gassing tanks with argon, sulfuring, anything we're doing to protect the wines, we can go into the winery. We've actually been doing that. So we're only working mornings at the winery, and then, keeping distant, trying to be smart about it, and then doing all the paperwork from home.
What about your sales though? I mean, how was that?
Have been challenging. So almost all small wineries are really reliant not only on restaurants but also small independent retailers, and that's true of us, of Bedrock. Anybody that's honestly not corporately owned, anybody that's below 10-20,000 cases, and independent retail's had a hard time too. Some are doing well. Wine consumption's up overall and was really up in March, but at the same time, a lot of that's buoyed by grocery store sales and big box retail, and a lot of that is served by Southern, Glaciers, Constellation, Gallo. So that's why you're seeing so many offers from small wineries right now, because they've lost all the restaurant independent retail. They're now turning to their mailing list, to try and weather the storm. It's had a huge impact.
Mm-hmm.
We are definitely less affected as Desire Lines just because we are so small.
Yeah.
And our sales goals were very cautiously budgeted this year. But there are other wineries that were slightly bigger than us that were sharing wine with restaurants to get the wine out there, share it with folks, and that's been a big challenge for them. It's hard to watch.
Yeah. Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if everybody remembers the Land of Saints wine that we released last month in April, Cody, I don't know if you know.
Yeah, Angela
and Jason.
Yeah, they're great. Yeah, she gets fruit from Shake Ridge too.
Yeah, and so they've got Tribute to Grace, which is a lot of mailing lists, but they're also in some retail and on-premise restaurants and stuff. But their Land of Saints brand is mostly just on premise, they said, and they export a little bit, but so this hit obviously as we had already kind of got everything in the works for our April release for those wines, which said that their sales dropped like 90% overnight.
I believe it. That's not an uncommon figure. There's definitely, they're right in that. They're big enough to be having some challenges now with distribution kind of flat and on premise.
Yeah. So it's definitely a scary time. How else is kind of life out there? I gotta assume it's pretty similar experience for most people in most places. But I think Sonoma County has been pretty well spared, and so is San Francisco from their aggressive shelter in place and early on stuff. But
yeah, it looks like
what's life like out there?
Oddly enough, in Sonoma proper, and I don't know if it's just me because I'm going to work every day or not, but it feels pretty ordinary. I mean, aside from the plaza's kind of slow, there's not a lot of tourists around. Restaurants are closed, obviously, but people have been, for the most part, really kind. And I think part of it's just because Sonoma County's had such a hard time the past few years with the fires, 17, 18, the power shut off. We're definitely used to kind of collective trauma of some sorts. And I think people have kind of learned how to deal with that. So it's shockingly pleasant to go to a grocery store. Aside from just how scary it is, I have yet to see anybody snap and be anything but kind and gracious, which is cool.
I might interject on one of the perplexing things about this is if you aren't having friends and family that are sick, the people that we are engaging with, I mean, it's remarkably how well-behaved and good citizens almost everybody around us are being. It's really quite impressive if you're not directly affected by the virus itself.
Yeah, it's really heartening. It's always good to see. In California specifically, looks like they'll start to ease up here in the next couple of weeks. Friday, 2 days from now, they enter phase 2, and they'll start to ease up retail. And a lot of that seems to be because they were so aggressive early on that infection rates have plummeted quite a bit. Who knows where that'll go in the next couple of months, but for now, we're all feeling pretty optimistic, cautiously. But
yeah, it's been amazing to watch for large states, right? California is the largest population in the country. Florida is the third largest. I mean, and we've all lucked out pretty well in terms of how low the counts have stayed for relative to our population. So same around our area. Most of us here on the call are in Tampa Bay. Ron's in Jacksonville, Joe's in Gainesville, but the rest of us are here in the Tampa Bay area. And it's the social distancing has been pretty strong, but otherwise it really hasn't affected too much day-to-day life.
That's great. I've been to Tampa once for a weekend, and I spent almost the whole weekend at Burns Steakhouse.
Oh, yeah?
But it seemed like a great city.
Good choice.
Yeah.
What took you there? Was it while you were working for Bedrock already?
Yeah, we actually did it as a company retreat of sorts. That's probably 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, we stayed at the hotel across the street. I would get out for a run just to break it up, but it's a great little place. It's a good one.
You didn't have to pay for the wine.
What's that?
I hope you didn't have to pay for the wine.
They definitely took care of us. We paid for some stuff, but they found some fun stuff for us.
Just got Burns takeout tonight. Actually, they're doing takeout now with all the COVID stuff. So we ordered it for my mom for Mother's Day. So just had a steak from Burns. A weird experience not seeing the wine list, but the steak is just as good, and that was pretty fun.
We were staying at the hotel, and they do those steak sandwiches there. I had one each lunch and took one to the airport and ate it in the Uber. Their food is fantastic.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Coach, this is Kyle. I'm in Tampa. Just curious, the vineyards that you buy from and source from, do the other winemakers source from the same vineyards? And if they do you have a chance to taste the wine that they make versus the wines that you're making, and maybe what some of the differences are? And I don't know if you could maybe talk about that.
Yeah, totally. And actually, I'm trying to think, pretty much all of our vineyards, there's at least a few other folks that make it, if not for the same variety, for sure the same vineyard.
Yeah.
And it's part of the fun because you do start to get a sense of what the vineyard signature is in the wine. Shake Ridge is probably the best example of that, which is 2 hours east of here up in Sierra Foothills. And Angela Osborne from Tribute to Grace, the winemaker for Land of Saints, gets the fruit too. She gets Grenache. And trying to think, who else would you know? Enfield Wine Co. gets a little Tempranillo from there. That's John Lockwood. Hardy Wallace for Dirty and Rowdy. I'm missing the 2 big ones. The name's going to escape me. And that vineyard in particular has this really like perfumed sort of purple fruit and fruit cocktail signature. And it does not matter for what the variety is. You can almost always pick it out. The foothills in general tend to be a little bit more tannic. So like our Shake Ridge, you notice the color's a little lighter. That's just a foothills thing. Doesn't matter what the variety is. Anywhere within 30 miles of Shake Ridge, like the color, it's a little lighter. It's probably that the night's a little bit warmer and anthocyanin doesn't bind as readily.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then Evangelo, also owned by Bedrock now, and they've gotten quite a few folks in there making really good wines. Carignan specifically would be Rory Williams. For Calder, his dad John started Frog's Leap, so he's got a very keen hand in the cellar. And our wines look very similar. He does élevage a little differently. I think he has a longer élevage. We rack after 10 months and blend in a little bit of a bed. But yeah, I like that really soft tannin on the Evangelo, the really juicy, vibrant acidity. All the vineyard, kind of the cherry and the black tea on top. It's all the vineyard. It's fun though.
Yeah.
Cody,
I think go ahead, Charles.
It sounds like there's a tremendous camaraderie out there between everyone to kind of, it's not a competition type thing. You're encouraging each other, you know each other, and kind of respect each other. That's very good.
It's exactly right. It was one
refreshing.
of the biggest surprises. You'd think it'd be a competitive industry because it is, in the marketplace at least, it's competitive. There's a lot of brands out there. There's a lot of wines. But for whatever reason, it's very much a rising tide floats all boats things. Like everybody is always willing to help out, advise, make introductions, come over and help bottle if you need a hand. Unfailingly, people are really stoked on each other's projects. It's cool. It's one of the best parts.
Since you mentioned Evangelo, and I think both that and the Moveds from Del Barba. It's both kind of same area. And do you want to chat? Because I saw some people were saying that the Evangelo open. You want to just tell us a little bit about that vineyard, because I think it has a pretty cool story, and to refresh people's minds, and just a little bit about what you think is unique about your wine coming from there. And I figure I'll bring up the map just to reference that for everybody.
Oh, cool. Let me bring that up a little bit bigger. There we go. Yeah, perfect. Oh, this is great. Okay, nice. That's right. So Contra Costa County, you can see San Francisco Bay there on the left side, which is west, and then San Pablo Bay. So right at the top of San Pablo, you're looking at Carneros, essentially. That's Napa and Sonoma. Yeah. And then right where San Pablo Bay skinnies down there, that's the Carquinez Strait. And that little piece is one of the defining features of all the vineyards in Contra Costa, all the vineyards being on the north side of the county, because it funnels all the winds. So if you've ever heard of the Petaluma Gap AVA, there are, and this is kind of true of California as a whole, as the Central Valley heats up over the course of the day, when the sun hits it, they get what they call convective uplift. And it acts like a giant vacuum. So as that heats up, it just starts to suck cold air inland. All the air sitting off the Pacific Ocean is really cold because the temp of the water never changes. And any place that convective uplift and the suction from it can find a way to the ocean, it'll pull cold marine air inland. So we're talking Templeton Gap down in Paso Robles. Chavos Creek is pretty close to that. Santa Barbara, Edna Valley, way south, is really exposed to the ocean because of that. And then around here, the Petaluma Gap is the main one. And this is the exact reason that San Francisco's fogged in for like 5 months of the year. The whole summer, when the Central Valley is warm, San Francisco is under a blanket of fog because of this effect. And all that air in this area locally gets funneled through that tiny little piece where San Pablo Bay becomes the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta through the Carquinez Strait. It's really high cliff banks there. There's a bridge that runs over it.
Because you're saying you got like Mount Diablo right over.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right by Walnut Creek.
Here, and that kind of is keeping all the wind funneled through this area, right?
Yep. And you can pull up, there's a really cool site called windy.com that'll give you real-time wind direction and speed and color. And there's always just this bright band of wind running right along that river. So past 10 a.m. usually at Evangelo, all of a sudden we're at least 10 mile an hour, if not 15 or 20. And it's rough to walk around in because it's a sandy vineyard. I mean, it's blown in your eyes constantly. The vines get beat up with it. But the reason that's so important for the way the wine tastes is vines will close the stomata on their leaves if the wind speed is above 8 miles an hour consistently. The problem being that they're using the stomata to release water and bring in CO2. But as the wind speed picks up, they lose way too much water, and the vine would wither and die if they kept the stomata open. So they essentially stop photosynthesis during the height of the day when it's really windy. And as a result, we get really bright, vibrant acidities out there. They don't respirate their malic and tartaric acid as quickly. And that's just simply because it's windy at a basic level. So that's kind of the defining feature of Contra Costa, in addition to it's really sandy out there. Because we're right on the banks of the Sacramento and San Joaquin, all the granitic sand, it's called Delhi blow sand locally, Delhi, like the city in India. Everything that's washed out of the Sierra over millennia gets piled up in these dunes locally. And that soil type is very specific to Oakley and Antioch, two little towns out there. You don't really see it anywhere else. But that also seems to sort of make the wines really silky, lightly tannic, very fine on the palate. And that's kind of true as a soil type across the world, like the sandy areas of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. In France, the wines are generally built a little more delicately, lighter tannin, finer, very silky mouthfeel. And because it's sandy out there, actually the vines are own-rooted too. Phylloxera doesn't survive very well in sand. And that's really rare. I mean, that is the treasure that is Evangelo. We've got 1890s planting on the own vinifera roots. And we're talking less than probably 0.1% worldwide. There are areas that do. Washington is for the most part unrooted. Chile actually has always been pretty much unrooted, but most vineyards, the vast majority, are planted to American rootstock.
Yeah. I'm scrolling through a couple of photos if anybody's looking at the shared screen here just to highlight what Cody's talking about. But here's some pictures of Evangelo that Cody sent me a few months ago. I mean, you can see that sand underneath these old gnarly vines, and just kind of how barren it is and flat, and you can imagine the wind really, really coming through here. But it's just all just planted in sand, like he's mentioning. So
it's like walking around a beach. It's slow work in the vineyard because it takes a while to get around. It's not easy walking. As far as we've dug down 40 feet, it is pure sand all the way to the bottom.
Wow.
Yeah. But those two things, when we talk about Contra Costa, we talk about sand and wind. Actually, to the point where it's a bedrock made kind of there's a single block in Evangelo right in the middle. Evangelo is 3 pieces. There's Carignan up here, there's Mourvedre, and there's Zinfandel. And right in the center, there's a little block that's all 3 interplanted. And in honor of Frank Evangelo, who passed away 2 years ago after he sold the vineyard to Bedrock, we put together just a piece of that block and bottled it and called it Sand and Wind and Love in Portuguese. So Arreo Vento e Amor. But the sand and the wind, that's Contra Costa. That is definitely, and that's why the wine tastes the way it does. They are, even though we pick the earliest out there, it gets going pretty early because it's a warm spring, because the temperatures are moderated by that bay nearby. Even though we pick, say, 3rd, 4th week in August, they are consistently the lowest pHs, so the most acidic wines we make at Bedrock, which is kind of weird. Usually you'd think you pick early, it's hot, the acidity will be low, and it's not the case in Contra Costa. because the wing keeps the acidities pretty high and the pH is pretty low.
And I mean, this is truly a really unique area of California, unique terroir. There's not really any other place like this.
No, it's entirely singular. At some point, I would love to see it be its own AVA. It is really amazing.
And I think the kind of crazy thing about it too, that people saw in that photo that I just had up, is just the weird juxtaposition of it. And when I wrote the guidebook, I really tried to explain what, I've never been to this particular vineyard, but I've driven through Contra Costa County. I'm very familiar with kind of what a oddly industrial area it is. And to have these sort of few special vineyards dotting the landscape still is super unique. So
yeah,
it's because these are like PG&E, which is Pacific Gas and Electric, has a power plant across the street. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The across the street in the other direction is a hotel that rents rooms by the hour, plus a little tavern. I mean, it's way out there. But actually, oddly enough, a lot of that vineyard land is now under threat from development. The local BART train station, that is the Bay Area Rapid Transit, just put in a new station in Oakley. And all of a sudden there's subdivisions, preschools, everything springing up like mad. And a lot of these beautiful old vineyards, Turley just had one of their main 3 vineyards planted in the 1890s that was sold last year for redevelopment, which it's hard to complain about. Folks got to live somewhere. But it's part of the reason Bedrock bought Evangelo Vineyard, to preserve that viticultural legacy. When the vineyards are that good and that rare and that endangered, we think it's important they stay in the ground.
Yeah, I think that leads in the next natural question, just about what Morgan did through founding the Historic Vineyard Society, and what you and Emily have done continuing to work with that.
Yeah, we think it's amazing. So that's an association of, it started, I don't know the founding details. Emily, my wife, kind of helps out with all aspects of the HVS. I don't even know what her official title is. She's not on the board, but takes care of all the details, essentially. And the founding members were Morgan from Bedrock, Tegan Pasalacqua from Turley, Bob Bialy from Robert Bialy in Napa, Dave Gates from Ridge, and Mike Officer from Carlisle. So all folks who focus on Zinfandel wines, but only as a byproduct of focusing on old vine historic field blends from California, stuff planted before Prohibition. And it was spurred, I want to say in 2007, Mike Officer had been getting a vineyard, beautifully farmed vineyard in the Russian River Valley, a couple miles west of Santa Rosa, planted in the 1920s or 30s, that they ripped out and planted Pinot. And not that Pinot isn't lovely, but there is so much Pinot planted in the RV, to the point where there's now, I'm sure we'll see prices fall because there is so much of it, because grapes work on an ag cycle. It takes 3 years once you plant it to get fruit, so you tend to miss the window in some cases unless you're careful about when you plant. And it was really heartbreaking because it was a beautiful vineyard. There was nothing else like it. And they founded a society to try to bring some recognition to these old vine vineyards. And winemakers love to wax poetic about old vines. Some of it seems like it'd be just simple marketing because they're really old. We're talking vineyards planted 1870s, 80s, 90s. I mean, way back there. We have vineyards where the vine architecture is perfect because it's been the same 3 or 4 generations of the same family training the vines. You can go and look at the arm of it where they've pruned every year, and it's, perfect because it's father to son to father to son to father to son that's taught each other how to prune, which is just the most wonderful thing. But it also does have a big impact on the wine too. At Bedrock, we have a lot of spaces, a lot of vineyards where we're taking the young vines and the old vines. And 19 times out of 20, the old vines are dramatically better than the young vines. And there's lots of theories as to why it is. They tend to regulate themselves better. In the drought years we had, 13, 14, 15, the old vines generally held the canopies better, the young vines. They're not as fruitful. That said, now that we're into the wetter years, like 19, the old vines didn't crop quite as vigorously. They're just a little more, well-mannered, I suppose. And you can always feel it on the palate. The wine is a little more centered and concentrated. But yeah, that's informed a lot of what we're looking for with Desire Lines too, is just we try and find essentially the oldest vineyards we can in a place that we think is cool with a variety we like. And a lot of that's from Morgan at Bedrock and the HVS. They've definitely gone out of their way to bring attention to old vineyards, try and keep them in the ground to get winemakers excited, to make wine from them, and try and get some money back in the grower's pocket to make sure the vines don't get ripped out, essentially.
Yeah. So one of the coolest things I did, it was about a month, maybe or 2 months before I moved away from Sonoma to come back to Florida, but I went to one of the grand tastings that the Historic Vineyard Society hosted in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
That was stellar. I think that's where I first met Emily. And I don't know. I don't think I met you that day, but I met her that day. Yep. And I mean, there were probably 50 plus winemakers on hand pouring their wines, all from 50 plus year old vineyards. And so something that I've determined is, and I know since then, the last couple of years, you guys have taken the show on the road a little bit, at least in a bigger net, but we'll see how we can figure out how to do something like that here in Florida. I think that'd be fun if you guys could kind of bring the message as well as the wines a little bit further out.
It'd be amazing. Yeah, I think they're hoping to cast the net farther afield. There's nothing winemakers love more than old vines. I mean, they make our job easy. If the grapes are good, there's not much we have to do to it aside from not goof it up. And old vines are one of the best hacks to get there. Yeah,
and tell a good story, right? And stories sell wine just as much as anything else, right?
Yep. And the visual of them is, I mean, they're so different, What was it? Morgan has a great story. I don't remember who it was, but I think it was his now brother-in-law, one of her girlfriend maybe, or maybe Kate's younger sister, whatever it was, her comment on Morgan's Instagram, which is just a bunch of old vine vineyards. It's like, what's the deal with all the dead trees on Morgan's Instagram? And it's just because they're vines, but they're not trained the same. They're trained in gobelets or head trained, we call it, where they're self-supporting. They're not lined up in those neat little lines. But yeah, the marketing on them is sexy too.
Yeah.
It helps to have a story.
Hey, Brian and Cody, at what point does a vine become an old vine?
So for the HVS, it's 50 years. And it has to be, I think, at least 2/3 of the original planting, if I remember right. It's a little tricky because every vineyard, like vines, die from any number of reasons. And generally that vine should be replaced. Otherwise the vine's around to become more vigorous. So there's no vineyard like Bedrock Vineyard planted 1888. There's no block in there where every single vine for an acre plus is that old. There are interplants. But that's part of the regulation, is making sure that there's not a single old vine. The rest of them are quite a bit younger. It depends on which region of the world you go to. A lot of people talk about getting 20 plus to start to see the vines settle down a little bit. Burgundy, people want to see 80 plus kind of to really start to think about an old vine. And that's kind of where Bedrock's at too, that like 80, anything planted, we use Prohibition because it's handy, but anything before 1930s kind of starts to hit a different tier for Bedrock.
And when you say consistent, year to year, the production is on the palate more consistent from those vineyards is what you're suggesting then?
Yeah, it's not, I mean, part of this is me because I taste more for texture than perfume. You definitely can see it on the nose, but it's the palate, it's the center of the wine, we call it. It's not as though it's bigger or more lush or anything like that. There's just there's a real concentration of fruit right in the middle of it where you don't notice otherwise a dip on the palate or a donut hole or however you think about the way the wine tastes. On a younger vine wine, sometimes, it's big up front, nice lush, and a good finish, and then also in the middle, there's not a ton there. That, for me at least, is what old vines fill out. You just get this concentration of fruit at lower sugars that's kind of remarkable.
Okay.
Cody, is there an age where old becomes stale? Does it ever reach that point?
Only if it's really heavily virused. But as long as the vines are healthy, I mean, there's a vineyard in Spain. You can buy the bottle. It's a $30 Albarino on the shelves. The vines are 220 years old. It's the oldest production vineyard in the world. And the wine's phenomenal. So most of the world over, we're capped by phylloxera because that swept the globe in 1870s, 1880s, and pretty much killed every vine in the ground. Not all of them, but most regions were heavily affected by it. So we don't really know what a vine for the most part would taste like about 150 years plus. But definitely for Bedrock, they continue to get better and better. And part of that's farming too. I mean, we put a lot of money at Bedrock into the farming. And that's certainly part of the reason they've become better. It takes a lot to keep a vineyard that old in the ground in terms of soil health, cover crops, nutrients, water. We have to train folks especially to keep them pruned correctly. But no, as long as you take care of them.
Yeah. Cody, another thing, you used that HSV or HSB. I'm new to this, so what does that mean?
Oh, it's the Historic Vineyard Society.
Oh, okay.
Just an acronym for the collection of folks that certify their vineyards.
Gotcha.
At some point, we're hoping to get a tax break from the state for the grower to keep the vines in the ground. There's been nothing on that yet, but right now, if you pull up the website, it's essentially a certification list of the old vineyards.
Okay.
And it's just a way to hopefully bring some publicity to it to allow winemakers to sell the wine maybe more readily and make sure that gets back to the grower to keep that vineyard in the ground is the goal.
It's actually a great resource too. If you're in the mood to go try to buy some wine from true old vines, it's a great source to go just to find that list, and you can see who makes wines from those vineyards, and it's almost a good shopping list to go by. But
yeah.
to add that old vine is not like a regulated term. So
Yeah, correct.
most of the stuff you see on wine labels is so heavily regulated, right? Like alcohol percentage, all the AVA, which is the viticultural area, the state that it comes from. Most statements on the label are super heavily regulated, but old vine is not one of them. So like if you go into the like a CVS, and you can find that like the OVZ or OZV, the old vine Zin.
Yep.
Reverse the letters, but they don't tell you how old the vineyards it comes from are, and they're probably making millions of bottles of that a year. It could be, from a 10-year-old vine, and they're calling that old vine because they're not required to as part of just that sales pitch.
Yeah, that's correct. It's too bad.
Yeah, it is. But I think that's what gets people when the term's just not well defined, so they don't know what they're getting. And most of these wines are so rare you can't find a $10 version of it.
No, that's the thing, right? There tends to be a cap on, because the vineyards are more expensive to farm, so it's tough to make a cheap wine that you can get in distribution into Safeway and Costco and stuff like that from an older vineyard. They require more love.
Yeah.
Cody, can you expand upon the changes of farming over the past 10 years for some of these vineyards? You touched on it briefly with just the care and the watering, but just curious, what's changed over the past 10 years?
Yeah, for sure. So this is kind of one of the really cool things about Bedrock is that we have sort of a farm league for vineyards. We have the single vineyard, the vineyard designates, the Bedrock, the Evangelo, stuff like that. Obviously, the best fruit we can find from the best parcel goes into bottle. And then there's a mid-tier called Old Vine Zin, average age of at least 80 years. And it's all the stuff that we didn't need to make the vineyard designate that year, for whatever reason, didn't quite fit the blend right. Old Vine Zin, and you guys will find that in Florida and stuff like that. And then there's a wine we call Shebang, which is our second label. And that is kind of a way, and there's a really cool project that does this in Spain too. We're trying to find ways to take the fruit from old vine vineyards that need a little bit of love, that need some consult on the farming, need some cover crops put in the ground, stuff like that, and still take that fruit. And Shebang is that, so it's the farm league. So it's a place we can send fruit to that's, the vineyard needs a little bit of work, but we want to start taking that fruit to keep that vineyard in the ground. And Shebang tends to be the place we put that. The stuff we've been looking at, so over the past 10 years, we've seen it for a couple different vineyards for Bedrock, where we start out and you can tell there's something there, but it needs work. And a lot of it comes down to soil health, actually. So we start to cover crop quite a bit to return nutrients to the soil.
What does that mean for a vineyard? Because I just, my family's grew up in the southwest corner of Minnesota, right? So I get it for soybeans and corn, but I don't necessarily get it for vineyards.
Yeah, right. And they don't do it. It's funny. We wouldn't have grown up far apart then, because I'm from Northwest Iowa.
Yeah.
You don't see a lot of it for corn or soybeans because they usually use. They started doing a little bit of what they call permaculture, where they don't till the soil.
Yep.
We use a combination of legumes, so nitrogenous stuff that uses nodules in the roots to fix nitrogen from the air and return it to the soil. So that is, for us, fava beans are a good one because they build an enormous biomass of nitrogen containing stuff.
So you will actually plant that in the vineyards then?
In the vine rows. So if you look at the sort of picture behind Ryan there, we talk about the vine row and then the tractor row. I'm sorry, the vine row. We usually plant cover crops down the tractor row. Legumes are great. We usually do something to be soil building. That is, the problem with a lot of legumes is they have a really thick taproot and they don't do a lot to build this really fine tilth of soil that can then suck up all those nutrients, hold water so we don't have to water at all. And rye, barley, cereal grains are really good at that. You ever pull grass out of the ground, it has that really like, trying to figure out how to describe it. The rooting system is just a lot finer.
Mm-hmm.
As it spreads those roots down through the ground, that helps to build what we call a more stable soil aggregate. And that all basically allows us to inject nutrients back in the soil without having to fertigate, to hold water more readily. If we're able to increase the biomass or the organic content of the soil by 1%, we save 16,000 gallons of water per acre that we don't have to irrigate. And almost all of our old vine vineyards are dry farmed. We don't irrigate, which is relatively important in dry climates. Water's shouldn't be as readily available as it is in California. It's very precious. And that's true of Spain, Italy, other places like that. And then canopy is important too. So part of the reason they're gobelet prune, the French term is a goblet. And if you look at it, it looks like a big goblet planted out of the ground. And that's essentially, we work hard to make sure all of the spurs, the pieces of the vine coming up with the fruit, are around the perimeter of that goblet. Yeah, there we go. And that's to get sunlight into the center, because sunlight's our best disinfectant. The thing we're working with grapevines is they're pretty prone to mildew, like roses. They're pretty finicky. And we can spray fungicides. We prefer not to have to spray a lot of fungicide. And sunlight and airflow is the best way to minimize that. So that one there in the center is a pretty good example of a beautifully gobelet trained grapevine where you've got spurs ringing the periphery in an open center. And then over the course of the year, we just work hard to maintain that. So we have to sucker to take stuff out of that middle, make sure that the canopy is right here. And then on top of that, we get nice sunlight exposure on the clusters, which is the piece that helps to build the flavor and the color in the grape clusters. And as you can imagine, all that takes money. It takes money to put cover crops in the ground. It takes money to train people how to do those vines. So it is a matter of asking the grower to kind of come along with you for a little bit and trust you, and then hope that they recognize the increased grape quality and wine quality, and then we can put it back in their pocket by selling the wine for a little more, basically.
Do they get better yield, or do you just get better grapes?
Generally, not better yield. At the very worst, at the very best, they get the same. I mean, so more conventional vineyards in Central Valley will carry like 10 to 15 tons an acre. It's a lot of fruit. But most folks worldwide, and if you're over 3.5, 4 tons to the acre, depends on variety, but you're probably not getting the best quality you can out of a vineyard. So even on young vines, we're cropping 3, 4, maybe 5 tons to the acre. And old vines just don't have that same energy. They're rarely over 3.5. It's part of what makes them so good.
Right.
We're not losing yield in the process, and we're maybe gaining back a little bit of certainty because they're less, I'm trying to figure out how to explain it. In making the vineyard healthier, it's a little more resilient. So there's that incentive, but no, they're not gaining yield by any means.
It's
a tough sell.
Quality over quantity.
Yeah.
More consistent quality from year to year, even more importantly, than quantity. Okay.
That's the hope.
And do you get any? Is there any revenue from the cover crop at all, or is that just so?
No, and actually, to get the benefit of it, you have to till it back into the soil.
Gotcha.
Or leave it for long enough that it starts to decompose and all that nitrogen leaches back into the soil profile.
Yep. So it's a pure cost. Okay.
Yep.
It's almost like growing it to feed the soil, growing food to feed the soil.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
It's all natural fertilizer.
Yeah,
it's
and
like,
that's largely
like
because
crop rotation, but you can't pull up your vines every year or fourth year. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So we actually, for the most part, only cover crop in the winter, and that is kind of our crop rotation. As soon as we pick, we try and get out there, disc if we need to prepare the soil bed, and then get the cover crop seed in the ground before the rain hits in November, say late October maybe. And then when California turns green in the winter, we get this massive cover crop stand. We've got some places that are up to my shoulders with fava beans.
Really?
And then come spring, when water becomes scarce again, California doesn't get rain between March and October typically. Those cover crops have to either get mowed or tilled back in so they don't compete with the vines for the water.
And the disking and tilling doesn't damage the root systems of the vineyard or the vines themselves, or you have to be careful as you do that?
You have to be a little careful. The older vines have deeper tap roots. Most of the feeder roots are close to the soil surface. Doesn't necessarily hurt to trim them because it forces them deeper into the soil profile to look for water. You're still being careful, but not too bad. We've started to move a lot of the vineyards for bedrock into no-till. And some of that is just environmental. Whenever you till, you turn over the soil and expose a lot of the microbes, and they're doing all the hard work.
Mm-hmm.
To ultraviolet light, it kills them all, so it tends to sanitize your soil. And on top of that, you volatilize a lot of nitrogen. So you've put nitrogen in, but you've just lost stuff from the previous year. Whereas soil is a pretty effective carbon sink. You can lock up a lot of carbon in a soil that doesn't get tilled. And as long as you find a way to manage using clovers to renew nitrogen, making sure it's not too competitive with weed whacking or something like that to deal with the weeds, you can have a system where you don't necessarily need to turn the soil and still get a really, really lovely grape crop out of it. Doesn't work for every vineyard, but where it does, we're trying to move in that direction.
So
What is your case yield on a ton of grapes?
Sorry, what's that?
What is your case yield on a ton of grapes?
Case
How much
yield.
wine do you get out of? Yeah, how much wine do you get?
Oh, that's a
out
good question. So depends slightly by the variety, but in general, most red grapes will give you 165 gallons per ton. I have to do some math here. It's roughly, say, 50 to 60 cases per ton.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Somewhere in the ballpark. White's a little bit
Yes.
less. And then if you're being careful about the Prescott's a little bit less there, but you're somewhere 150 to 170 is kind of the ballpark.
And a barrel yields what, 25 cases per
Yeah.
barrel?
So a ton is roughly, it's 2.5 barrels, somewhere in that range. Yeah, so you can imagine most of our wines, we're taking one vine row, maybe two. Not taking, that's the other challenge in getting folks to change the farming is unless you're one of the biggest players in the vineyard, you're asking them to put in a lot of work and a lot of time for a very small amount of grapes. It's a big ask.
So let me ask you this, Cody, because you obviously mentioned, you didn't grow up in California, you didn't grow up in wine, you went to school for business and economics, right? And
Yeah, that's right.
science and economics, and so you've clearly learned a hell of a lot about farming and about the science of winemaking. All that is a lot of that just on the job learning. Was it self-taught, or did you go back to school for some of that?
A little bit of everything. You'd think it'd be in my blood from being from Iowa, but I hadn't no green thumb whatsoever. It definitely didn't get me there. On the job, a lot of it. Morgan cares most deeply about vineyards. Of anything we're doing at Bedrock, like having a vineyard that's in really good shape and giving you great grapes is the easiest way to make a great wine. That's all that matters. We've put together a team that really cares about that stuff. So Jake, the viticulturalist, and Sarah are both super sharp in vineyards. Luke and Steph and I would almost always rather be in a vineyard than a cellar for the most part. And I've also tried to do a lot of book learning. I'm in the Masters of Wine program, and one of the 5 theory papers is on VIT. So I've tried to dive into the books a little bit too and sort of pick my way through it. But it is a deep rabbit hole. It's an endless well of stuff you can learn about vines.
So Cody, when you have a commitment to a certain portion of a vineyard for your production or your crop, are you out there inspecting this, or do you rely on bed? Yeah. So, okay. So you have a hands-on, or people are hands-on to make sure your rows are the best they can be.
Yep. Yeah. And this is true for a lot of folks. We don't tend to do a lot of the farming ourselves. Some people do. It's hard and it takes a lot of labor and a lot of labor hours. So even at our scale, there's no way I could farm. And we were only taking at 200 cases. I would have a hard time keeping up with all the sprays, which need done every 7 to 10 days, all the weed whacking, all the pruning. It's a lot. It takes a lot of labor. That said, for Design Lines, Bedrock, most small wineries are being really careful to get out in the vineyards pretty readily and keep an eye on stuff. And it's also why we're really careful about who we work with. The grower is almost as important as the vineyard. And Kramer at Shake Ridge is one of the best growers in the state, and she makes my life so easy just because she's on it. Everything is really dialed, whereas there are some vineyards where the quality's there, but you maybe need to keep a closer eye on it and it changes by the year too. Some years the top 19 was hard in a different way in that the yields are really high. So that was a different conversation than we were having in 13, 14, 15, where the drought was pretty severe and we were worried about losing crop from that. But yeah, we try and be in vineyards a lot. Bedrock has a team of 2 between Jake and Sarah that are doing pretty much vineyard loops 5 days a week to check out the 50 or 60 vineyards that we source for Bedrock. And they're doing work along the way and delivering stuff, but it is a constant just checking in.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's your biggest headache on a usual year?
Oh, that's a great question. It's not a headache because I like it, but logistics is certainly a challenge for wineries. We have a lot of vendors we pull from for not even just winery. Once you even get past the vineyard and wine production, bottling is still a whole nother thing. You're using a different vendor for corks, labels, glass, bottling labor, stuff like that. There's definitely, I've got 40 people, not that I have a Rolodex, but that are very important to how our wine tastes. And I have to be in pretty close contact with all of them. It's definitely it is a small industry and a tight network. We rely on a lot of folks to take care of stuff between the grower, people in the winery, trucking, transportation. It is really logistics heavy.
Wow.
And then once we bottle it, we got to send it out to a couple different fulfillment houses, and there's a lot of hands that touch the fruit, the barrels, and the bottles before we get to put our name on it, basically. A lot of spreadsheets, in other words. And I love spreadsheets, but it's still, there are days I'd rather be in a vineyard than doing a spreadsheet.
Brian, when it's convenient, I have a very personal question to ask.
Go ahead. Sorry, what was that?
No, I just have a question. I typically have not enjoyed Rieslings because I don't particularly like the sweeter wines. And every once in a while, I find a drier Riesling that blows me away. But you love Rieslings. Tell me a little bit about why you love Rieslings.
Ironically, I think initially I liked it because it tasted like Mountain Dew. And growing up in Iowa, you can find Riesling that's really acidic and really sweet. And that was kind of I joke that I'm in wine because of German Riesling, and that's part of it. Cabernet Riesling, where it's only 8.5% alcohol, but 50 to 100 grams residual sugar. Those glasses, it's easy to go through a couple glasses quickly. I've definitely, like you, trended. I like drier Rieslings now. It's an amazing grape. Before the 1900s, it was the world's most revered grape variety. German Riesling sold for more than anything else. Bordeaux, Burgundy. You can look at old, the lists from, say, the Waldorf Astoria in New York, pre-1900, and Riesling is always at the very top. And it's just because it's so transparent. It reveals sight really, really precisely. It's been a little tricky, and that's definitely why it's never caught on in the States, I think, is that because it is so acidic and so phenolic as a white, it hides sugar really well. And people have always had a hard time explaining to people what it'll taste like. So even though I call ours a dry Riesling, it's still, the 2018 is still 4 grams residual sugar. And I think most folks would be hard to pick that out unless they're a winemaker. It just tastes fruity and rich, but it's so acidic that it can be hard to tell what the sugar is there. But there's also a long history in Germany of making Riesling at all sweetness levels. So it's been hard to communicate to the consumer what it is they should expect to taste. But I adore it. It's so aromatic. It's really sensitive to sight. So everyone tastes different, even if it's a block down the street. It grows pretty well in Germany, Austria. Honestly, it's funny. I didn't think we'd find it here in California just because on the face, it sounds kind of silly. It grows well in Germany in the Mosel, which is 50 degrees north latitude. It's almost the most northerly vineyard area we have in the world. So cold that they have to plant it on slopes that are like 30 to 40 degrees looking at the river so they get the reflected sunlight to actually fully ripen the grapes. Whereas California's a Mediterranean climate, we're mostly warm, and it seems kind of silly that we would then do Riesling well. But we do have cold little pockets. Coal Ranch that we pull fruit from is so far up in the mountains and close enough to the coast that they split the difference between being maritime and being cooled by the Pacific and then being somewhat continental and having really cold nights. So they get snow a couple times a year. And I mean, they're 15 miles from the coast. That's pretty rare in California to get snow that close to the coast. And we picked the second or third week in October, and it's so cold in the mornings. We've picked 4 years now, and before the sun comes up, the grapes clusters are frozen on the vine. It's like 25 degrees. So there are definitely cold pockets in California. That's kind of what we're looking for. But
And I'll have to toot your horn really quickly, because in case people didn't see the email I sent out when we were advertising this event, that you just got some stellar scores back from Antonio Galoni, who is raving about your Riesling. So if you guys have the chance to jump onto Cody's website and buy something, it's really worth a try. I think he gave you 94 points, which, I mean, this one critic, if you haven't read Venice, the website, INOUS, I mean, he's got a stellar palate and really likes well-balanced wines. And so coming by that score is pretty hard. So congrats on that. And
Thank you. We were especially excited about that Riesling score. I mean, I love Riesling. And to see him appreciate that was cool. That's tied for the highest score he's ever awarded to a California Riesling. And tied with Bedrock's Coal Ranch Riesling. And our grapes and Morgan's go into the press together. It's the exact same juice. The only difference is what we do with it after we press it. It's a special vineyard. But yeah, that was really cool to see Antonio get behind that.
Yeah.
Cody, that's going to be my one question. When you work with these different vineyards, do you have specific rows that you are allocated, year in and year out, or is it collective and you get the same juice as the next winemaker, but it's just then the fact of what you do with it afterwards?
Yeah, right. It depends. For the most part, folks are definitely assigned their own rows. It changes in older vineyards so for Evangelo and for Cole, we're always there in the morning to pick, and we tend to pick the exact same block, maybe not the exact same vines as the previous year, but maybe the vine, the row over, something like that. Cole Ranch, our Riesling is unique in that because Bedrock makes one too, we share a press load. That's the only case where we're getting the same juice and making 3 different wines out of it, because Bedrock makes 2 and I make 1 for ourselves. Mm-hmm. Everything else, for the most part, the fruit going into the tank is slightly different from the guy that got the vine rows next to you. Shake Ridge, we contract for rows specifically. At Lehigh, our cab site, we contract for blocks specifically. But for the most part, winemakers are relatively picky, as you can imagine, about where their fruit's coming from. So it's rare for someone to say, I'll take fruit from wherever you happen to pick it from, and I'll just pick it up that morning. You're usually there on the pick to make sure you're getting what you wanted, making sure it looks right.
So you guys do your own harvest then? You bring in a team to harvest your crops?
Usually the grower takes care of it, contracts with a labor crew. Okay. But I truck the fruit for quite a few of our picks, and Bedrock does too for the smaller stuff. And usually you're there because it's the grower's best day of the year. Yeah. Their job is done. They're about to get paid. I've had folks putting out muffins, coffee. It's a fun day.
Do they determine the pick date, or do you?
The winemaker does.
Okay.
Almost exclusively for all the Bedrock wines, for all of our wines. There's some give and take. As labor's gotten a lot tighter, it's gotten harder to call a pick. So it used to be we could call a pick with 2 days notice, no problem. At this point, depending on when we're picking, we kind of need to give 3 to 6 days notice, just because farm labor crews are so hard to come by and spread pretty thin.
And are you taking samples of grapes every day leading up to that to get the balance you want?
We'll test every 3 or 4 days for Bedrock. For Desire Line, since I'm cast a little farther afield, we're testing ideally every weekend. My day off, I'll go out and check most of our vineyards. And it's part of the reason why we try and find a vineyard and stick with it, because as you start to accrue sort of experience with that site and that grower, you start to get ideally sort of a sixth sense about where that crop's going to go in the next week, depending on what the forecast looks like. It's one of the harder parts. You'd be surprised how boring grapes taste. They're good, but you don't necessarily. It's really difficult to taste a grape and picture what it's going to taste like 2 years from now in bottle.
And is it a physical taste, or are you doing Are you taking chemical measurements of it, of whatever it is?
A little bit of both. So we always, it's important both how the vines look and the fruit looks, and then also we'll do taste. And then we run 2 metrics on it. We'll run what we call bricks. And it's literally, you're just checking the density. and you assume that almost all the solute is sugar, and for the most part it is. So you're checking sugar concentration, and then we check acidity with a pH meter. The other things people might check would be the individual components of tartaric acid and malic acid, which are the two grapes respirated by the grapevine, but for the most part, Brix and pH will get you there. So you're tracking sugar and acidity. Sugar rises, obviously, and acidity falls, and trying to find a sweet spot, because you need sufficient sugar, but not too much, and ideally you'd like some acidity, but not too much in the finished wine.
Gotcha.
It's an art and a science.
Everyone wanting to do the pick at the same time, right?
What's that?
It leads to most winemakers wanting to do, you're working the same acreage, right? Similar pick times, right?
Especially in hot years like 17, where sugars are moving really quickly. That's become a challenge in California. It's part of why we have to give more notice too, just because as things are warming up, all of a sudden sugars go fast. The vines literally speed up for the most part until 95 degrees, at which point they shut down. But yeah, we see sugars spike 2 or 3 degrees Brix, which is quite a bit in like a week. It can definitely get away from you if you're not keeping an eye on it.
So does that make your job more difficult on the back end with mixing then?
Not too bad. For almost all the Desire Line stuff, we don't blend per se.
Sure.
Everything we're doing is a single vineyard from a single pick from a single block. At some point, as we grow, we'll start to roll out a blended wine. And there are some benefits to that, because there are great wines made by blending, and certainly in tough years, Bedrock gets this. I mean, Bedrock is vineyards strung out all over the state, and part of it is so that for Old Vine Zin, we can always put the best thing possible into bottle. If one area and we've done this for Desire Lines too, especially with wildfire risk and stuff like that, if there's a, say, little growing region that had a hard year and quality's not quite there, you can lean more heavily on the other years in that blend to get the best wine into bottle.
Ryan, I'm not sure how much time you allocated for tonight, but Becky and I are going to sign off shortly. But I just wanted to thank you for doing this. I wanted to thank Cody for sharing.
My pleasure.
I had a great time. I really enjoyed what I learned tonight. Thank you so much.
And the wine is
Nice to see your face.
And the wine was awesome.
Thank you very much.
And we'll order the Riesling. I guarantee you.
Perfect. I hope you enjoy it.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Becky. Thanks for joining us tonight. And, yeah, I was looking at the clock here and kind of allotted about an hour to this. But why don't we just see if anybody else maybe say, let's take 2 to 3 more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So anybody got anything else they wanted to chat about?
Yeah, hey, Cody, it's Kyle. Just curious, you're talking a lot about between the winemakers and the growers and the vineyard owner. Can you talk about like the relationship that maybe the winemakers have to have with the growers? Because, I mean, you got to be able to kind of talk back and forth as far as I want to pick now, or I want you to do this or not do this. And can you maybe talk about that and how important that is to kind of what you do?
Yeah, no, I mean, you said it perfectly. It's absolutely critical to have someone who understands their vines really, really well, to have someone with a really good green thumb. And then also ideally to have someone who's good with people too. Like the grower's job is not easy. Ann Kramer at Shake Ridge has, trying to think, 30 acres planted, I want to say, and she probably has 50 clients, each of whom wants to make a different wine. And part of the reason she is the absolute best is what she does is because she will tailor the farming to whatever you want from the finished wine. She's got clients that don't want to pick until the grapes are well above 26 Brix, so making very, very ripe wines, and she can do it. She's got folks like her who want to pick way before that, and she can pull that off too, and then we're kind of right down the middle. But I mean, Ann's absolutely amazing. And she manages to do that all with the logistics of picking with a small crew and getting the fruit out the door. And that's one of the more challenging parts of it. And when it's not going well, I mean, we're lucky in that we have really good growers, but the grower winemaker relationship it can be challenging.
Yeah, you got not only do they have to deal with the vineyard and trying to make that as best they can, they have to deal. It's almost customer service too with all the winemakers. So that's
And at a basic level, winemakers want growers to spend more money in drop crop, basically taking money out of the grower's pocket. And the grower would kind of prefer to do the opposite. You're trying to find the middle where you maximize quality in a way that still makes it economical for both parties when it comes down to it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It can be done well, and I mean, we've learned so much from Morgan and Chris in that respect, and Morgan takes a lot of that from his dad, Joel. I mean, Morgan's dad that has started Ravenswood, buddy. And we've learned so much from seeing how they deal with folks, because it is important, and at its best, it's a really friendly relationship.
Nice, thanks.
Yeah, of course. Good question. This is Caleb.
Thank
He's
Caleb.
not been great yet, but isn't sure about wine.
Not yet.
What do you think, buddy?
Anybody else? Anyone have any kind of final closing thoughts that are out there for Cody?
You being silly.
Well, thanks, Cody. Do you want to mention, how I know we've just sent out. Is there anything else you kind of want to leave in everybody's the back of their mind, or something that you think they really ought to try, or if they hopefully once this all gets lifted, I'll be like rushing right back out to cinema.
I can plug our next release at the very least. We're going to send out an email tomorrow. I was telling you guys that the first wine we ever made we didn't release, and we're finally going to do that. So next week, Tuesday, we're going to sell our 2014. And the nice thing about it is because the grapes are a gift, our cost is really minimal. So we're going to sell it and give 50% of the sales to a couple different restaurant worker charities, and then try and get the rest of that wine to restaurants at cost. We're talking like $2 a bottle, to help them get cash flow positive. But if you want to sign up with a mailing list, you can find us on the website, desirelineswines.com, and you'll get an email from us.
Cool.
But thank you for the time. It was really lovely to chat with you all.
We like
Thank
the
you.
Vineration people the best of all.
Good.
They're the
We
smartest.
appreciate that. And Cody, Emily, and Caleb, thank you guys for giving up a little bit of your evening for us. It was good to see your faces, and hopefully we'll do something like this again soon.
It's been my pleasure.
We'd love
Thank you, Brian.
to.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks, guys.
Enjoy the
Thank
wine.
you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Cheers.
Take care.
Brian.
Cheers.
Yeah, buddy.